There is one detail in this file that makes almost everything else harder to understand. Investigators dug into the ground in different parts of the United States and found sealed containers filled with weapons, ammunition, cash, restraints, tools, gloves, and false identification. The strange part was not what was inside. It was when those containers had been placed there. Some of them had apparently been hidden years before the crimes they might have been intended for. Years before anyone had disappeared. Years before a victim had been chosen. Think about that for a second. Normally, investigators work backward. They find a victim. They look for a motive. They look for someone connected to that person. They trace a weapon, a car, a phone, a relationship. But what happens when the person responsible chooses the location before choosing the victim? What happens when the weapon is already waiting underground hundreds or thousands of miles from his home? What happens when there is no personal connection to find? That was the problem the FBI would eventually face. But nobody knew any of that yet. All they knew was that a young woman working alone inside a small coffee kiosk in Anchorage, Alaska, had suddenly vanished. And almost everything she owned was still there. Her purse. Her coat. Her keys. The person missing from the coffee shop was 18-year-old Samantha Koenig. Her boyfriend, Dwayne, was the first person who realized something felt wrong. He had been trying to reach Samantha throughout the evening of February 1, 2012. Calls went unanswered. Messages went unanswered. That was unusual. According to the people close to her, Samantha normally responded quickly. Half an hour without an answer might have been nothing. Several hours was different. Eventually Dwayne drove to the coffee stand. The business was dark. Closed. But when he looked through the window, Samantha's things were still inside. Her bag had not gone with her. Neither had her coat. Neither had her keys. And that creates an immediate problem. If Samantha had simply decided to leave work early, why leave behind the things she would normally take with her? Dwayne contacted Samantha's father. He had not seen her either. The owner of the coffee shop was away on vacation, so Dwayne reached him as well. The owner remotely accessed the shop's surveillance system. And there, finally, was something investigators could actually work with. The video showed a man approaching the drive-thru window at around 7:56 that evening. He was wearing dark clothing and a hood. At first, nothing looked especially unusual. He handed Samantha a travel mug. She took it and turned away from the window to prepare the drink. It was the kind of interaction she had probably repeated countless times. She finished the drink. She turned back toward the window. And her body language changed. Her hands went up. Slowly. Like someone had just pointed a weapon at her. The camera could not clearly show what the man was holding from that angle. But Samantha's reaction told investigators enough. The man climbed through the service window. He had restraints with him. He bound Samantha's hands. And outside, tracks in the snow led away from the coffee stand toward a white pickup truck parked nearby. The truck drove away. So now the case was no longer simply a missing person report. Someone had apparently entered the coffee kiosk, taken a small amount of money, restrained Samantha, and forced her out. Local police asked the FBI for assistance. Investigators began with the obvious things. Samantha's phone. The surveillance video. The vehicle. The area around the coffee shop. Phone records showed Samantha's device stopped transmitting around 8:15 p.m. Its final activity was close to the coffee shop. The surveillance footage gave investigators a white pickup truck. But here was the problem. Anchorage in winter is dark. Snow reflects light. Security cameras from that period were not giving investigators the kind of clean license plate image people imagine when they hear the word surveillance footage. The plate could not be read. Investigators compared the shape of the truck, the spacing of the lights and other visible features. They narrowed it to a Chevrolet pickup. That sounded promising until you considered where they were. A white Chevrolet pickup in Alaska was not exactly rare. Thousands of vehicles could fit the general description. So the camera had captured the abduction. It had captured the general type of vehicle. It had even captured part of the offender's movements. And somehow, it still was not enough. But only hours after Samantha disappeared, someone made a mistake. And the mistake happened at Dwayne's home. Dwayne told investigators that in the early morning hours, around 3 o'clock, he noticed a figure outside near his pickup. A large person. Dark clothing. Face obscured. The figure appeared to be using a flashlight to look through the vehicle. Dwayne shouted. The person ran. At the time, Dwayne did not necessarily connect it to Samantha's disappearance. It could have been someone looking for something to steal. But when he checked the truck later that morning, he found signs that the passenger side door had been forced. The center console had been searched. And here is where the behavior gets strange. There were things in that vehicle worth stealing. They were left behind. The intruder seemed interested in one thing. Samantha's bank card. That card was missing. Dwayne and Samantha shared the pickup, and investigators now had a very simple question. Why would the person who abducted Samantha go to the trouble of finding a second vehicle, breaking into it, searching through it, and stealing only her bank card? The most likely answer was also the most useful one. He intended to use it. The FBI placed an alert on the account. If the card appeared at an ATM, investigators wanted to know immediately. And while they were waiting for the card to move, Samantha's phone suddenly came back to life. Dwayne received a message from her number. The message suggested Samantha was upset and wanted to leave town for a few days. The owner of the coffee shop received a similar message. If you heard only those messages with no other context, maybe they could sound ordinary. Someone needs space. Someone wants to disappear for the weekend. Except everyone already had the surveillance footage. Samantha had not walked out of work because she needed time alone. She had been taken. Which means somebody else was almost certainly using her phone. And that tells us something important about the person investigators were dealing with. He was not simply trying to escape. He was trying to create time. If Samantha could be made to look voluntarily absent, perhaps the urgency around the search would weaken. Investigators questioned family members, friends, co-workers, and anyone who might know where Samantha could be. Nothing made the messages more believable. The days continued passing. No Samantha. No clear suspect. No readable license plate. No useful phone location. And no ATM transaction that gave police the breakthrough they needed. 3 weeks went by. On February 24th, 23 days after Samantha disappeared, Dwayne received another message from her phone. This one was different. It referred him to a public notice board at Connors Lake Park and mentioned a photograph connected to a notice about a dog named Albert. Dwayne contacted police and Samantha's family. They went to the park. There was a wooden public bulletin board near the entrance. They found the notice. Below it was a transparent plastic bag secured with tape. Inside were two things. One was a ransom demand. $30,000 was to be deposited into Samantha's account. The other was a photograph of Samantha. And for a brief moment, that photograph seemed to change everything. Samantha appeared to be looking directly at the camera. Her hair had been arranged into 2 braids. Her face had makeup on it. Her eyes were open. The photograph created exactly the impression the person who made it wanted to create. Samantha was alive. Pay the money, and maybe she could come home. Her father deposited the money. Then everyone waited. No release instructions came. No call saying where Samantha could be found. No message telling the family what to do next. Instead, the bank card became active. Money started coming out. The person behind the ransom had what he wanted. And Samantha was still missing. But this photograph was about to become something far more important than a ransom demand. Because investigators at the FBI laboratory looked at it much more closely than a frightened family ever could. And once they did, the photograph stopped looking like proof of life. There is a reason this image became such a disturbing part of the investigation, and it is not because of anything graphic. It is because the photograph appears, at first glance, to answer the question everyone desperately wanted answered. Is Samantha alive? The image seemed to say yes. But the closer technicians looked, the more artificial it became. Around Samantha's eyes, they detected details consistent with a very thin line being used to hold the eyelids open. Her appearance did not show the natural signs investigators expected from a living person posing for a photograph. The makeup. The carefully arranged hair. The open eyes. Things that had initially suggested life now looked more like staging. The conclusion investigators were forced to consider was devastating. Samantha may already have been dead when the ransom photograph was taken. Someone had apparently tried to create the illusion that she was still alive in order to obtain money. Read that part again in your head. The ransom was not necessarily being used to keep a hostage alive. It may have been created after there was no hostage left to save. And if that was true, the entire investigation had just changed. The FBI now had to follow the one piece of the offender's plan that was still moving. The bank card. On the same day the ransom money was deposited, the card was used at an ATM in Alaska. Officers rushed toward the location. By the time they arrived, the person was gone. Surveillance recorded a figure wearing clothing that obscured the face. Not enough. The FBI prepared to respond quickly if the card was used again. The assumption was that the offender was still somewhere around Anchorage. That assumption did not survive for long. About a week later, the card appeared thousands of miles away. Arizona. A small town near the desert. Not Anchorage. Not even Alaska. More transactions appeared farther east. New Mexico. Texas. Now investigators had an entirely different problem. How had the person using Samantha's card moved from Alaska to the American Southwest so quickly? Driving the entire distance would require an exhausting trip of roughly 50 hours or more behind the wheel. Possible, perhaps. But tight. Flying made much more sense. So the FBI began looking at passenger records from flights leaving Anchorage. At the same time, investigators gathered surveillance footage from ATMs where the card had been used. And one of those cameras gave them something the Alaska footage had not. A vehicle they could identify more precisely. The person using the card was now associated with a white Ford Focus. Different vehicle. Remember that. The coffee shop abduction involved a white Chevrolet pickup. The ATM activity outside Alaska involved a white Ford Focus. That suggested a simple possibility. The offender could have flown out of Alaska and rented a vehicle elsewhere. Investigators obtained the license plate. They checked rental records. The car had been rented in Las Vegas on March 7th. And for the first time, a name entered the investigation. Israel Keyes. Until that moment, the case had revolved around Samantha. Her boyfriend. The coffee shop. A white pickup. A stolen card. A staged photograph. A trail of ATM withdrawals. Now investigators had an actual person. They started checking him. Keyes was 34 years old. He lived in Anchorage. He worked in construction and operated his own small business. He had a daughter. He had lived what looked, from the outside, like a fairly ordinary life. And he owned a white Chevrolet pickup. Investigators compared his truck with the vehicle visible in the coffee shop surveillance footage. The spacing of the lights. The bumper. The position of the toolbox. The visible features lined up. Now the two ends of the case were starting to touch. The vehicle near Samantha's abduction pointed toward Keyes. The rental car tied to the ATM withdrawals pointed toward Keyes. Investigators reconstructed his recent movements. Starting from Las Vegas, The Ford Focus had moved across several states while Samantha's card continued being used. The withdrawals appeared in city after city. Different times of day. Different kinds of locations. Gas stations. Commercial areas. Places where a traveler could move quickly and blend in. The latest transaction in the source file was recorded in Texas on March 12 at 9:47 p.m. The FBI sent out an alert for the rental car. The next morning, Texas officers located the white Ford Focus in the parking lot of a Holiday Inn. They did not rush straight into the hotel. Investigators believed the driver could be armed. A confrontation inside a hotel could put other people at risk. So they watched. Around 2 in the afternoon, the man left. He drove away and entered Highway 59. And then something almost absurdly ordinary happened. He exceeded the speed limit. Not by some spectacular amount. Just enough to give officers a clean reason to initiate a traffic stop. The patrol car pulled him over. The driver was Israel Keys. He was arrested without the kind of dramatic chase people might expect from a case like this. Inside the vehicle, investigators found Samantha's phone. They found her bank card. For the first time since the night at the coffee shop, the case was no longer chasing a shadow. They had the man connected to the truck. They had the rental car. They had the phone. They had the card. The obvious question should have been simple. Where is Samantha? But what happened in the interview room made the case much bigger. Because Keys did not react like a man surprised to be sitting there. When investigators asked whether he knew why he had been arrested, his response, according to the source account, was essentially that he did. Samantha. No elaborate denial. No visible confusion. Yet he was not immediately willing to explain anything either. He asked for a lawyer. For days, and then weeks, investigators had to wait. Meanwhile, the FBI searched his home in Anchorage. Inside, they found firearms and tools. But Samantha was not there. There was no obvious explanation inside the house itself. And if investigators had stopped with the main residence, they might have missed the most important place on the property. Because in the yard sat a small shed. No windows. A heavy lock. And when that building was opened, the investigation changed again. The shed did not look extraordinary from the outside. That is probably what makes it harder to process. It was the kind of structure you might expect behind the home of a construction worker. A place for tools. A place for materials. A place nobody else in the household had much reason to inspect closely. The door was locked. Investigators treated the structure carefully and moved it so it could be examined under controlled conditions. Inside were storage containers and equipment. And investigators recovered Samantha's DNA. At that point, whatever distance remained between Israel Keys and Samantha's disappearance was shrinking fast. He eventually began talking. But not freely. Keys treated information like currency. He wanted things in return. According to the source file, one demand was speed. He did not want years or decades of appeals and legal procedures. He wanted the death penalty process handled quickly. The other demand involved his daughter. He wanted the details of his crimes kept away from her as much as possible. He did not want her identity swallowed by the public image of her father. This is one of the stranger contradictions in the entire file. A man suspected of abducting another family's daughter was intensely concerned with what his own daughter would eventually know about him. Investigators asked what exactly he was offering in return. And this was the moment the Samantha Koenig investigation stopped being only the Samantha Koenig investigation. Keys indicated that Samantha was not the first. And she was not the only one. He suggested that this other life stretched back years, even as far back as 1998. Investigators had walked into the interrogation room trying to solve one abduction. Now they were potentially sitting across from someone connected to crimes scattered across the country. Before the FBI could rely on any of that, they needed proof. Keys told them Samantha was dead. The photograph had already led investigators toward that conclusion, but hearing it directly removed the last realistic hope that she was being held somewhere. He described what happened after the coffee shop abduction. He said he drove around Anchorage for a period of time rather than going directly home. Only later, once his daughter was asleep, did he bring Samantha onto the property and into the shed. She was restrained there. According to Keyes, Samantha told him her bank card was not with her. It was inside the pickup she shared with Dwayne. She gave him the location and the PIN. That explanation connected another strange piece of evidence. The figure Dwayne had seen near his truck around 3 in the morning. The forced passenger door. The searched console. The fact that valuables were ignored. The missing card. What had looked like an unrelated vehicle break-in was not unrelated at all. Keyes said he went to Dwayne's home to get the card. Dwayne saw him. Keyes ran. But he still managed to obtain what he wanted. Samantha, Keyes said, had been killed before he left Alaska on a family trip. I am not going to dwell on the violence here because the investigative sequence matters more. The source records that Samantha was sexually assaulted and killed inside the shed. Her remains were concealed there. And then Keyes did something that explains why the ransom photograph did not appear until weeks after the abduction. He went on vacation. He had already arranged a trip. He left Alaska with his former partner and his daughter for a Caribbean cruise. From roughly February 2nd until February 17th, he was away. Samantha remained hidden in the locked shed during the Alaska winter. The cold preserved her body. When Keyes returned, according to his confession, he began constructing the false proof-of-life photograph. He warmed the shed. He arranged Samantha's hair. He applied makeup. He placed a newspaper dated February 13th with her to create the appearance that she had survived beyond the night she disappeared. He manipulated her eyelids so they appeared open. He photographed her. That was the image sent through the ransom scheme. This is the moment when several details that had seemed separate suddenly fit together. Why wait more than 3 weeks to demand money? Because the ransom idea, according to Keyes, was developed later. Why make Samantha look carefully groomed? Because the photograph had to convince her family she was alive. Why send messages suggesting she had left town voluntarily? Because the offender needed time. Why steal the bank card? Because the money was part of the plan. The ransom demand was $30,000. Once the money entered Samantha's account, Keyes began taking it out. But he still needed to dispose of her remains. He told investigators he used his construction tools to make transportation easier, placed the remains into separate packages, weighted them, and drove to Matanuska Lake, roughly 80 kilometers from Anchorage. The lake was frozen. He used an ice drill to create openings and placed the packages into the water. That confession gave investigators something they had been missing since February 1st. A location. On April 2nd, search teams entered the freezing water. At approximately 3:17 that afternoon, divers located packages in the mud. Samantha Koenig had been missing 61 days. She had finally been found. If this were an ordinary homicide investigation, that discovery might represent the point where the case begins moving toward closure. But investigators were now sitting on a completely different problem. Keyes had already told them Samantha was not his first victim. So on the evening of the recovery, the FBI went back to the interview room and asked the question that now mattered most. How many? Keyes paused. His answer was vague. Fewer than 12, he suggested. He had not exactly kept count. And that answer opened a door the FBI would never manage to close. At first, investigators had only Keyes's words. That was not enough. A person sitting in federal custody can say almost anything. The FBI needed something independently verifiable. Keyes eventually gave them 2 names. William and Lorraine Currier. A married couple in Vermont. And suddenly investigators had a test. If Keyes could describe a real unsolved disappearance from the other side of the country, one he had never publicly been tied to, then the FBI had to take the rest of his claims much more seriously. William was 49. Lorraine was 55. William worked caring for animals at the University of Vermont. Lorraine worked as a nursing assistant. They lived a quiet life. On June 8, 2011, both returned home from work. Neighbors later recalled nothing especially unusual around their house. By the following morning, neither had shown up for work. That was unlike them. Friends went to check. Inside the home, things were wrong. A telephone line had been cut. There were signs of disturbance in the bedroom. A firearm William kept in the house was missing. Their vehicle was gone. There were indications that someone had entered by force. Police searched. Volunteers joined. Woods were checked. Waterways were checked. Abandoned areas were searched. Weeks passed. William and Lorraine appeared to have vanished. No bodies. No clear offender. No explanation that moved the investigation forward. The case became one of those files that stays open because the people inside it have not been found, but there is nothing left to follow. Almost a year later, Israel Keyes was arrested in Texas. And sitting in an interview room thousands of miles from Vermont, he knew their names. He knew details. He knew where they lived. He described what he said he had done. According to Keyes, he had flown to Chicago, rented a vehicle and driven toward Vermont. He did not go there because of William. He did not go there because of Lorraine. He claimed he did not know who his victims would be. He had traveled because he intended to kill someone. He drove around looking at houses. Not people. Houses. He considered location. Neighbors. Lighting. Dogs. Security. Escape routes. Eventually he selected the Keyes home. And that is where the case becomes difficult for traditional investigative thinking. There was no relationship to uncover. No workplace connection. No online argument. No financial dispute. No romantic history. No obvious reason William or Lorraine would ever appear in the same file as Israel Keyes. He said he entered the home late at night. He disabled the phone connection. He controlled the couple using a weapon and restraints. He moved them into their own vehicle. He took them to an abandoned house he had identified earlier. Both were killed there. Again, the important point is not the violent detail. It is the preparation. Keyes knew the abandoned structure existed. He knew it was unlikely to be disturbed. He had apparently considered the location before choosing the victims themselves. And this raises an uncomfortable question. How do you solve a homicide when the offender is not choosing a person? He is choosing circumstances. William and Lorraine's vehicle was later abandoned. The building where Keyes said their bodies had been left created another problem. It had been demolished. Construction debris had been hauled away to a landfill. So even with a confession, the FBI still had to prove what it could. Teams searched the landfill in July 2012. Investigators in protective equipment sifted through enormous amounts of debris. At one point, a long bone was found. For a moment, it seemed possible the search had finally worked. Laboratory testing determined it was not human. The search continued. More than 1,000 tons of material had to be considered. Rain. Decomposition. Time. Contamination. Every day that passed made identification harder. Eventually the search was stopped. William and Lorraine's remains were not recovered. Their families held a funeral without their bodies. And for the FBI, the Courier confession did something more important than confirm another crime. It demonstrated that Keyes could appear in a state, choose people with whom he had no known connection, kill them, leave, and return home without creating an obvious link between the cases. But investigators still did not understand how far in advance he planned these trips. That answer came from something Keyes had buried underground. When Keyes finally explained the buried containers, investigators realized they had been looking at his travel pattern the wrong way. He described a habit that went back to his childhood. As a boy, according to the account in the source file, he had liked hiding objects. Small stolen items. Knives. Things buried where only he knew how to find them. As an adult, that habit apparently evolved into something far more calculated. Keyes said he buried what investigators came to understand as caches or murder kits in different parts of the United States. Not one. Potentially many. He was uncertain about the total. 10. Perhaps 20. Possibly more. Some had been underground for years. The containers were sealed to protect their contents from water and weather. He described burying them deep enough that animals would not easily uncover them and ordinary surface activity would not expose them. He preferred places that were isolated enough for privacy but not so remote that reaching them became difficult. Areas near water were useful. Large trees could serve as landmarks. GPS coordinates could help him return. Sometimes he used physical markers only he would recognize. And this is where the logic of the crimes becomes much clearer. Imagine investigators at an airport. They are looking for someone traveling with a weapon. Keyes did not need to. Imagine police stop his rental car before an attack. The equipment might not be inside yet. Imagine detectives compare weapons from two different crimes. Keyes could use different weapons because the kits were already placed in different locations. Imagine a murder occurs in Vermont and police check every person connected to the victims. Keyes lived in Alaska. He could arrive by plane, rent a car, retrieve a kit buried years earlier, select victims who had never met him, commit the crime, dispose of the equipment, return home. Where exactly is the pattern? That was the system. And the FBI did not have to rely only on his description. Keyes provided information that led investigators to buried caches. One was recovered in Alaska. Another was found near a reservoir area in New York, according to the source file. Inside one of the containers were items including a handgun, a suppressor, ammunition, cash, false identification, restraints, tape, rope, a knife and gloves. It was not a collection assembled in panic. It looked like preparation. The source records roughly 200 rounds of ammunition and about $5,000 in cash in one cache. That money matters. Because a hidden supply of cash means fewer financial traces. A hidden weapon means fewer travel traces. False identification means another layer between the traveler and his real identity. And the restraints and tools mean he does not need to purchase them immediately before a crime. Each layer removes something investigators normally search for. A receipt. A purchase. A gun registration. A connection. A local acquaintance. A repeated weapon. A known target. This is the detail I keep coming back to. The kits appear to have existed before the victims did, at least from Keyes' point of view. He prepared for an unknown person. That is a completely different kind of planning. The FBI wanted the locations of the remaining caches. Keyes would not simply give them up. Again, information became leverage. He offered pieces. A location here. A crime there. A state. A vague description. But not everything. Investigators tried using his travel history to predict where other containers might have been buried. The problem was scale. Keyes had traveled extensively. Any wooded area. Any reservoir. Any remote roadside location. Any place near a body of water. Potentially hundreds or thousands of possible points. Searching the country for a sealed plastic container buried under several feet of soil without exact coordinates is almost impossible. And this is why the kits are more than strange evidence. They explain how his crimes could remain disconnected. But to understand why investigators had not noticed his movement earlier, they needed to understand the life he returned to between those trips. Not because his childhood gives us a simple explanation. It does not. But because from the outside, Israel Keyes did not look like someone constantly moving through unresolved case files across America. Keyes was born in 1978 in Utah, one of 10 children. The source describes his family as highly isolated. His parents had been associated with Mormonism and later moved into a more extreme religious environment that included white supremacist beliefs and rejection of much of modern culture. Much of Keyes' childhood was spent in a remote area of Washington state. There was limited outside contact. His parents were strict. Keyes later described harsh physical punishment. But we need to be careful here. A difficult childhood does not explain murder. Millions of people grow up around violence, isolation, or extremist beliefs and never hurt anyone. The reason this background matters in this file is more specific. Keyes described behaviors beginning when he was young that later resembled parts of his adult pattern. He talked about harming animals. He talked about burying objects. He talked about keeping secret hiding places. At 19, he left that environment and joined the United States Army. Military service gave him experience with firearms, field skills, and operating under pressure. Again, none of those skills make a person violent. But later, when investigators were trying to understand how he could travel alone, move through remote areas, use weapons comfortably and maintain control under stress, those abilities became relevant. Eventually he built another identity entirely. Worker. Business owner. Father. Neighbor. Around 2007, he settled in Anchorage. He worked construction and later operated his own company. Clients apparently saw a competent tradesman. He repaired homes. Worked with wood. Handled roofs. Used tools. The locked shed behind the house did not look out of place because this was a man who worked with tools for a living. That detail matters. The same building that concealed evidence could plausibly exist on the property without attracting attention. Keyes also had a daughter. People around him saw him spending time with her. Parks. Fishing. Bicycle rides. The source repeatedly emphasizes that his daughter mattered greatly to him. During interviews, his concern about what she would learn became one of the few subjects that appeared capable of changing his behavior. Investigators confronted him with the contradiction. Samantha was someone's daughter too. So were other people he might have harmed. How could he separate those things? Keyes' answer, according to the source account, was essentially compartmentalization. Family was one part of his life. Crime was another. He did not see them as connected. And that separation may be one of the reasons people near him did not understand what they were living beside. He could return from travel and resume the role everyone recognized. He could work. Take care of his daughter. Run his business. Weeks or months could pass. Nothing visible connected the ordinary man in Anchorage to an unsolved disappearance in Vermont. The FBI now faced a strange inversion. Usually, investigators find crimes and search for the person connecting them. Here, they had the person. Now they had to search backward through 14 years of the United States and ask which crimes belonged to him. Keyes made that process as difficult as possible. He hinted at Washington. He mentioned activity on the East Coast. He referred to robberies. The source says he talked about a bank robbery in New York and a fire in Texas. But the information often came without the one thing investigators needed. A specific victim. A specific date. A specific address. He would give them enough to make the statement sound meaningful, but not enough to close a case. It became a negotiation. And the FBI believed time was on its side. Keyes was in custody. They could keep interviewing him. Keep checking travel records. Keep using verified cases to test what he said. Gradually, perhaps, they could identify more victims. But Keyes believed he had made a deal of a different kind. He wanted the legal process accelerated. He wanted control over publicity involving his daughter. He wanted certainty. And when he felt he was losing that control, his cooperation changed. The first visible sign came in a courtroom. On May 23, 2012, Keyes was brought to federal court in Anchorage for a hearing. The appearance itself was routine. What happened as officers prepared to move him out was not. Keyes suddenly broke from his position and ran toward the exit. According to the source file, he had managed to loosen his leg restraints. Court officers reacted immediately. Several moved toward him. He was stopped before he escaped. There was no long chase. No disappearing into Alaska. The attempt failed almost instantly. But investigators noticed a change afterward. Keyes became less cooperative. He complained that the government was not giving him what he believed had been discussed. He wanted movement toward a rapid death penalty. He wanted greater protection from media exposure, especially where his daughter was concerned. Instead, the case was becoming national news. His name was spreading. His crimes were being discussed publicly. The more control he lost, the less information investigators received. This is important because at that stage, Keyes's memory was effectively evidence. Somewhere inside his answers were names the FBI did not know. Locations they could not find. Buried kits they could not recover. Families who did not know what had happened to missing relatives. If Keyes stopped talking, those cases stopped moving. Investigators kept trying. But his responses became shorter. Silence lasted longer. He had spent years designing crimes around the idea that he controlled the location, the timing, the victim, and the evidence. Now every meaningful decision about his life belonged to someone else. Prosecutors, judges, correctional staff, investigators, the courts. And the process he wanted accelerated could still take years. On December 2, 2012, a correctional officer performing an early morning check at the Federal Detention Center in Anchorage looked through the window of Keyes's cell. At first, Keyes appeared to be lying on his bed. The officer was about to continue. Something about the position looked wrong. Too still. The cell was opened. Keyes was dead. The source account describes a razor blade in bedding used as part of the suicide. How he obtained the blade remained unclear in the file provided. Investigators estimated he had been dead for several hours before he was found. And with that, the FBI lost the only person who knew the complete map. If Keyes had left behind a list of names, investigators might still have been able to work through it. He did not. If he had written coordinates for the remaining caches, search teams could have gone directly to them. He did not. If he had explained the unresolved cases he had hinted at, families could at least have received answers. He did not. What he left behind instead was deeply strange. There were handwritten pages filled with dark language that did not provide investigators with the information they wanted. And among his belongings were 12 drawings made with his own blood. 11 depicted skulls. Marks resembling crosses appeared on their foreheads. A 12th image depicted a horned, goat-like figure. Almost immediately, people asked the obvious question. Why 11 skulls? Keyes had previously suggested his victim count was fewer than 12. 11 fits beneath 12. So did the drawings represent 11 victims? Maybe. But this is exactly where we have to be careful. A matching number is not proof. The drawings could have had a personal meaning investigators never established. They could have been symbolic. They could have been deliberately misleading. They could have been Keyes's final attempt to control the way people interpreted him. The FBI could not simply label each skull a victim and close 11 files. They needed names, locations, evidence. And those were gone. So investigators had to do something much harder. They had to build a second investigation without him. Not from confession. From data. Phones remember movement. Banks remember money. Airlines remember passengers. Rental companies remember vehicles. The FBI began collecting as much of Keyes's digital and financial history as it could. Cell site records. Travel information. Bank accounts. Credit card activity. Anything capable of placing him somewhere at a particular time. The first pattern involved his phone. There were periods when the device suddenly stopped generating useful location data. Not for a few minutes. 4 days. When it appeared again, Keys could be in another area. Those gaps became interesting because some lined up with known or suspected criminal activity. The Courier case provided a useful example. During the period around his travel from the Chicago area toward Vermont, the phone history contained a blackout. No simple digital trail showed his movement through the critical window. When the phone reappeared in the records, the crime had already occurred. Investigators found other gaps over the years. A phone shutting off is not proof of murder. People turn devices off. They lose service. Records can be incomplete. But when you are studying someone who has already admitted deliberately traveling to commit crimes, repeated periods of digital silence become significant. Especially when those periods overlap with travel. The bank records produced another pattern. Keys had legitimate construction income. That part looked explainable. But the source account also describes money appearing from unclear sources, often around periods of travel. The FBI began considering whether robberies helped fund later trips. Cash from one crime could pay for flights. Rental cars. Fuel. Hotels. Another trip. Another place. Another cash. If that reconstruction was correct, Keys had created something like a closed system. Commit one crime. Use the proceeds to finance movement. Travel. Turn off the phone. Rent a vehicle. Retrieve previously buried equipment. Choose a target. Return home. Wait. Repeat. The FBI fed Keys's travel information into VICEAP, the national system used to compare violent crimes. Investigators began looking at unresolved disappearances, kidnappings, and homicides that occurred when Keys could have been in the area. Matches began appearing. Not proven matches. Possibilities. A missing person in one state. Keys traveling nearby. An unresolved case along a route. A phone blackout at a similar time. A rental vehicle. A cash transaction. Individually, each item could be coincidence. Combined, some became difficult to ignore. But coincidence is not evidence. That distinction is the reason this case remains so frustrating. Imagine a family has been waiting 10 years to understand why someone disappeared. The FBI tells them Israel Keys was near the area. His phone may have gone dark. The timing fits. His known method could fit. But there is no DNA. No fingerprint. No body. No confession naming their relative. What do you tell that family? You cannot say he did it. You also cannot easily say he did not. The FBI asked people whose relatives had disappeared during the relevant years to come forward if the circumstances might overlap with Keys's movements. Hundreds of families responded. For investigators, every response was another file. Another timeline. Another comparison. Another possibility. And in most of them, the same wall remained. Keys had designed his crimes to avoid creating connections. Random victims. Long-distance travel. Rental cars. Phones turned off. Different weapons. Buried equipment. Cash. No obvious motive connecting him to the people he chose. The very thing that made him difficult to catch while he was alive made it difficult to identify his victims after he was dead. And when you look back at Samantha Koenig's case, the irony is almost impossible to miss. For years, Keys appears to have worked hard to avoid patterns. Samantha's case was solved because he broke his own system. He used her bank card repeatedly. He moved money. He created a trackable trail. He rented a car. He continued using the card while crossing the country. The ATM network turned his movement into a line investigators could follow. Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, a rental car, a name, a traffic stop. He had spent years trying to make himself invisible. A bank card made him visible. But even that does not explain why Samantha became the victim that exposed him. According to Keyes, there was no long plan involving her personally. He was driving. He saw the coffee stand. It was open. Only one employee appeared to be working. He watched. He decided the circumstances were favorable. That is the part of the confession that is hardest to accept emotionally because we naturally want a reason. Why her? Why that night? Why that coffee shop? People want the answer to contain a relationship because relationships make danger feel understandable. An ex-partner. A co-worker. A financial dispute. A stalker. Someone with a grievance. Something that can be recognized. Keyes' answer was that there was no relationship. Samantha was there. The conditions worked. That was enough. And if that account is true, it also explains why the early investigation had so little to grab. Police could search Samantha's life forever and never find Israel Keyes inside it. Because he may not have been there until minutes before the crime. This is where the phrase random victim needs to be examined carefully. Random does not mean careless. Keyes' own descriptions suggest almost the opposite. He claimed he could select victims without a personal connection, but the circumstances were evaluated. A business with one worker. A house with limited security. A quiet street. An isolated location. A place where he could control movement. So the person may have been random. The opportunity was not. That distinction matters. In Vermont, he said he drove around studying homes. He considered the physical environment. In Samantha's case, he said he observed the coffee stand and saw a young woman working alone. The victim was not necessarily chosen months earlier. The setting was judged in real time. And behind that real-time decision could be preparation completed years before. This is what separates the Keyes investigation from the simple image of a killer moving impulsively across the country. According to his own statements, preparation and spontaneity existed together. Prepare the tools. Prepare the money. Prepare the travel habits. Prepare the hiding places. But leave the identity of the victim open until the conditions are right. For detectives, that is a nightmare. Behavioral patterns help investigators connect crimes. Repeated weapons. Repeated victim types. Repeated disposal methods. Repeated geography. Repeated communication. Repeated signatures. Keyes appears to have understood, at least on a practical level, that repetition creates connections. So he changed things. Different states. Different rental vehicles. Different equipment. Different types of victims. Different circumstances. Even his home base worked in his favor. Anchorage is far from many of the places investigators eventually examined. A Vermont detective looking at the disappearance of a middle-aged couple would have little reason to pull the name of an Alaska construction contractor into the first round of suspects. And an Alaska detective looking at Samantha Koenig's abduction would not automatically search through a Vermont cold case from the previous year. Those cases existed in separate worlds until Keyes himself connected them. That is why his death damaged the investigation so badly. Investigators could use databases to find overlaps. They could reconstruct travel. But only Keyes knew which overlap was meaningful. If he happened to pass through a city on the same day someone disappeared, that does not make him responsible. If he switched off his phone near the same time, still not proof. If he withdrew cash, rented a car or stayed in a hotel, still not proof. The FBI could build suspicion. It could not manufacture evidence. And there was another complication. Keyes sometimes seemed to enjoy controlling the flow of information. He did not tell investigators everything at once. He made them negotiate. He gave partial clues. That raises another uncomfortable question. How much of what he said can be treated as completely reliable? The courier details could be independently checked. Samantha's case could be checked. The caches could be checked. Those verified pieces gave credibility to other statements. But credibility is not the same as certainty. A serial offender can tell the truth about one crime and distort another. He can exaggerate, minimize, forget, manipulate, lie. The FBI had to treat every statement as a lead until evidence supported it. That is why the 12 drawings cannot simply become a victim count. It is why fewer than 12 cannot become a final number. It is why every missing person case that overlaps with a Keyes trip cannot automatically be attached to him. The most responsible answer is also the least satisfying. We still do not know. And we may never know. Go back to the coffee stand. Not knowing anything about Keyes. Just look at what investigators had in the first 24 hours. A young employee missing. A small robbery. Security video showing a man coming through the service window. A white pickup. Snow tracks. A phone that stopped communicating around 8:15. A boyfriend who saw someone near his truck several hours later. A bank card missing. At that moment, none of those things says national serial offender. Nothing says buried weapons in New York. Nothing says an unsolved couple in Vermont. Nothing says years of phone blackouts. Nothing says sealed containers waiting underground. The scale of the case was invisible. And that is what I think makes this file so unsettling. Not the idea that investigators missed one obvious clue. They really did not have an obvious clue pointing to the larger truth. They had pieces of a local kidnapping. The offender's wider pattern existed outside the boundaries of the case they were investigating. Even the white pickup looked ordinary. Thousands of people could own something similar. The surveillance camera did its job. The phone records did their job. The ATM alerts did their job. The breakthrough happened only when Keyes kept touching systems that recorded him. The bank. The ATM camera. The rental company. The highway patrol. Each system captured a different fragment. No single fragment solved the case. Together, they formed a path. And notice which piece was the most damaging to Keyes. Not DNA from a national database. Not a witness recognizing his face. Not an informant. Not someone close to him becoming suspicious. A rental car connected to an ATM withdrawal. A small administrative record. The kind of thing most people would never think of as dramatic. That is a recurring truth in complex investigations. Big cases often collapse around small records. A receipt. A timestamp. A toll record. A vehicle registration. A bank transaction. A phone reconnecting to a tower. The offender can control what he says. He cannot always control what systems remember. Keyes understood this well enough to turn his phone off during certain trips. He understood the value of cash. He understood rental vehicles. He understood using tools that were already waiting for him. But Samantha's card became a thread. And he pulled it across multiple states. The FBI followed. Once Keyes was in custody, investigators learned what the thread had actually been attached to. Not one crime. Potentially many. That is why Samantha's case is not merely the final known crime in this source. It is the crime that exposed the architecture behind the others. The shed revealed one part. The caches revealed another. The caches revealed another. The travel records revealed another. The phone blackouts revealed another. And each discovery made the original question more complicated. Who took Samantha? Israel Keyes. That question was answered. How did he avoid detection for so long? Partly answered. How many people did he kill? Unknown. Who were all of them? Unknown. Where are all of the remains? Unknown. Where are all the buried kits? Unknown. What exactly did the 11 skulls represent? Unknown. And one of the strangest things is that investigators got closer to the truth than they may ever get again. They had Keyes alive. They had him in an interview room. They had verified crimes. They had his attention. They were negotiating. They believed there would be more time. There was not. There is an image from this file that is difficult to forget. Not the ransom photograph. Not the surveillance footage. Not even the drawings. A sealed container under the soil. Because that container represents a crime that may never have happened. Or a crime that did happen and has never been connected. Maybe it was buried and never recovered by Keyes. Maybe he used it and moved it. Maybe another kid is still exactly where he left it. The source describes investigators believing other caches could remain somewhere in the United States. If that is true, they are unusual pieces of evidence because they are disconnected from a known crime scene. A gun underground means very little until you know what it was used for. A rope means very little. Cache means very little. A false identification means something, but perhaps not enough. Without Keyes, even finding one could create more questions than answers. Was this kit used? Which trip was it connected to? Was there a victim nearby? Which missing person file should investigators reopen? That is the larger problem Israel Keyes left behind. He did not simply conceal evidence. He separated evidence from context. A weapon in one state. A victim in another. A home thousands of miles away. A rental vehicle returned to a company. Cash spread across transactions. A phone deliberately silent. A body concealed in a location with no connection to his normal life. When investigators find only one piece, they may have no reason to know the others exist. Samantha's case brought those pieces together because Keyes made enough mistakes in one investigation. He abducted her from a location with surveillance. He took her bank card. He used her phone. He created a ransom scheme. He continued withdrawing money. He traveled with the card. He rented a traceable vehicle. That accumulation finally gave investigators something his earlier method had often denied them. Continuity. A chain. Coffee stand. Pick up. Bank card. ATM. Rental car. Keys. Shed. DNA. Confession. Lake. Kayas. Caches. Travel history. Possible unknown victims. One clue opened the next. And that brings us back to the paradox at the start. Police normally hope that crimes contain patterns. Patterns connect evidence. Patterns identify offenders. Patterns turn separate files into one investigation. Israel Keyes appears to have spent years trying to remove exactly that advantage. No fixed victim type. No single territory. No necessary relationship. No single weapon. No need to transport his equipment from home. No phone during certain periods. No obvious reason for an investigator in one state to look at a case in another. He was not perfect. Samantha's bank card proves that. But the method was effective enough that even after his arrest, even after his confession, even after his death, investigators were still unable to map the full extent of what he had done. And maybe that is the part worth remembering. Not the mythology around a serial killer. Not the drawings. Not the idea of some criminal mastermind. Because eventually, he was caught. A bank card and a rental car were enough to tear through much of the image of invisibility. The disturbing part is what remained outside the chain of evidence. The people whose names he never gave. The trips the FBI could reconstruct but not explain. The black spaces in the phone records. The unresolved cases that line up just enough to raise suspicion but not enough to provide proof. The Courier family never received recovered remains. Other families may not even know whether Keyes belongs in their story. And somewhere, if his statements about the remaining caches were accurate, there may still be sealed containers under ordinary ground. Near a road. Near water. Beside a tree. Places people pass without noticing. That is why the smallest detail from the beginning matters so much. The person who took Samantha did not know her because of some long relationship. According to his own account, he saw an opportunity. That single fact explains why investigators could search her life and find nothing leading toward him. The connection did not exist until the night she disappeared. And once you understand that, the entire file changes. Because the real question is no longer only how Israel Keyes hid. It is how investigators are supposed to find a person who deliberately gives them almost nothing to connect. In Samantha Koenig's case, he finally gave them something. A card. A trail. A mistake. It was enough to find him. It was not enough to find everyone else.